I'm Duke Blackwood, and I'm the director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, and it is my distinct honor to welcome you here this evening. Now, as usual, before we get started, I ask that you please turn off your cell phones and pagers and anything else that might bother us during the program. Now, before I introduce our guest tonight, I want to make sure that everybody has a great time this evening. And so tonight, I think you're going to have a pleasure of a gentleman who's going to give us some insight that is quite exciting. So now I'd like to introduce and welcome the former First Lady of the United States, Mrs. Ronald Reagan, escorted by Secretary Michael Chertoff. Now, I ask that you please remain standing so we can say the pledge. Okay, you can come on. In honor of the men and women who serve so proudly across our country and throughout the world, please join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Please be seated. It's great to have you here this evening. There's a couple of people that I'd like to introduce and recognize. First with us tonight, the lovely wife of our local legislator, Eldon Gallagher. Please welcome Janice Gallagher. And of course, we are blessed here at the Reagan Library to have many in the community that we consider friends. And now I'd like to recognize a few of those. First of all, our supervisor, Peter Foy. Sheriff Bob Brooks. And all of the representatives from the cities of Simi Valley and Thousand Oaks. We appreciate all the help that you provide us throughout the year. Now I'd like to take a moment to recognize someone who is quite special around here, someone who continues to provide leadership, someone who serves as an inspiration and always knows what's best when it comes to Ronald Reagan. Please welcome and recognize Mrs. Ronald Reagan. It's always a pleasure to have you here, Mrs. Reagan. In December of 1983, President Ronald Reagan held a question and answer session with reporters regarding security issues in Lebanon. During his remarks, he stated, "The report draws a conclusion that the United States and its military institutions are, by tradition and training, inadequately equipped to deal with state-supported terrorism. I wholeheartedly agree. The thrust of the history of this country is that we have recognized a clear distinction between being at peace with other states and being at war. We have never before faced a situation in which others routinely sponsor and facilitate acts of violence against us, while hiding behind proxies and surrogates which they claim they do not fully control. We need to recognize that the worst outcome of all is one in which terrorists succeed in transforming an open democracy into a closed fortress. The problem of terrorism will not disappear if we run from it. Our guest speaker tonight understands this more than most. As Secretary of Homeland Security, Michael Chertoff and his office were responsible for protecting the American homeland and the safety of its citizens. In July of 2005, after being in office only 5 months, Secretary Chertoff developed a 6-point agenda to ensure that the department's policies, operations, and structure address the potential threats, both present as well as in the future. Some of these included increased overall preparedness, particularly in the case of a catastrophic event, better transportation security systems, strengthening our border security and reforming the immigration process, and finally, enhanced information sharing with our partners. Secretary Chertoff then spent the next few years implementing that plan. But as he also worked to protect us, he did something anti-Washington. He created NIMTOF. No, it's not an anti-terrorist weapon or an elite secret organization, not even the code to stop a nuclear attack. NIMTOF stands for Not in My Term of Office. This soon became Secretary Chertoff's crusade as he worked to stop elected officials who only focus on projects that benefited an election cycle. Quoted last month in a U.S. News and World Report article about not getting credit for all that Homeland Security does to stop attacks, Secretary Chertoff said, "That's fine. What I wouldn't want to do is be in a position where something happened and I said, boy, I had an opportunity to stop it, but I didn't have the willpower." We are honored to have someone here tonight who has the same principles and fortitude of the man whose name adorns these walls and whose impact is still felt today. Many of you know that President Reagan had a plaque on his desk that said, "There's no limit to what a man can do or where he can go if he doesn't mind who gets the credit." Perhaps if President Reagan would have met Secretary Chertoff, he would have presented him with his own desk plaque that read, "No more NIMTOF." While his term is over, Secretary Chertoff remains steadfast in his advocacy of freedom and the protection of our nation's security. It is my distinct honor and privilege to welcome Secretary Michael Chertoff.
Well, first I want to extend my gratitude to Mrs. Reagan for inviting me to address you all here at the library. It's a great honor. It's one of the great honors I've had in my career, and I was very much looking forward to this moment, to be able to speak to you and to do so in the shadow of this great library and memorial to President Reagan and what he stood for. I have 3 political heroes that I've looked to at various times when I performed my public functions. You're probably not going to surprise people here who they are. One is President Reagan, one is Winston Churchill, and one is Abraham Lincoln. And what they had in common was a steadfastness, an ability to focus on the strategic picture, on the values and principles that are important. They were willing to take tactical steps forward and back and this way and that way, but they weren't willing to alter their principles. And most important, they did not measure success by the approval of opinion polls or editorial pages or political commentators. They recognized that the reward for doing a job well done is in the product that comes at the end. It's not the applause or the approval or the compliments that come along the way. And therefore, to be here and to even be mentioned in the same breath as Ronald Reagan is a kind of a daunting compliment. But I thought what I would do is talk a little bit about Homeland Security in the spirit of what I think President Reagan brought to this country, because I think we face challenges in the 21st century that are different than, but no less serious than those that President Reagan faced when he took office in 1981. And let me begin by saying that NIMTOF, not in my term of office, I can't take credit for that particular acronym. There's actually a professor at the University of Pennsylvania named Howard Kunruther who coined the term. But when I read it, I felt it accurately captured much of what is wrong with Washington in this day and age. It is the tendency of political figures to act not based upon what's going to make the country better in 10 years or 20 years, but what is going to produce a tangible result before the next election campaign. And therefore, the kinds of investments that we need to protect ourselves over the long run don't get made because the fruits of the investment are not going to be seen for 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. And that's why I think that that plaque that I saw on President Reagan's desk upstairs in the library is so meaningful. If you take the question of who gets the credit out of the equation, suddenly it's possible to really achieve the kinds of results that we owe our country, that we owe our predecessors, and that we owe our children. So what is the particular challenge I want to talk about in terms of Homeland Security and its importance to us? Well, I would say there's one thing that has changed as regards terrorism since the days President Reagan held office and since the time that he gave the remarks that Duke quoted. Because in this day and age, we fear not only state-supported terrorism, but we fear terrorism that has grown organically through a non-state process, through a networking process, which is both one of the positive features of the 21st century, but also, frankly, one of the big threats. The ability of groups of people to find themselves over the internet, find each other over the internet, to begin to connect with each other across the globe, not using the instruments of state power or the tools of a modern state or a modern military, but using the technology that now empowers even a single individual to do a lot of good, but also to do a lot of damage. And these non-state networks, whether it's Al-Qaeda or Hezbollah, or even some of the massive transnational organized criminal gangs we now see in parts of the world, these networks have the capability to pose a danger to us and to our allies around the world that used to be only the kind of threat that a state could pose. The problem is we've now seen technology distribute awesome weapons and awesome capabilities around the world in a way that no longer assures that it's only a state power that can exercise those capabilities. And part of what this new world challenges us in is what is the doctrine that we use to deal with terrorism. In the old days, and that's not that old, I mean, I go back to when I was doing this stuff when President Reagan was president, so it was about 25, 30 years ago. But in those days, everything seemed very neatly divided. There were military problems and there were law enforcement problems. There was war and there was crime. We knew that if things happened overseas and involved nation states, we tried diplomacy, and if necessary, we used F-14s. And if things happened here at home and there were problems and threats to our security, we had the police or the FBI take on those threats. When I was a young prosecutor during President Reagan's tenure, I worked for a person some of you may know, Rudolph Giuliani. I was the first assistant U.S. attorney he hired when he became U.S. attorney in New York. And one of the things he asked me to do, and I think he had actually briefed the president on this, was to bring a case against the bosses of the American Mafia, La Cosa Nostra, the commission, which was the board of directors of organized crime from coast to coast. And because of Rudy's vision and the support of the president, we not only brought the case, but we convicted all of the members of the Mafia Commission and sent them to jail for 100 years apiece. So those were the good old days. We all knew if it was a crime, we dealt with it as a crime. If it was a war, we dealt with it as a war, and that never the twain shall meet. But in the modern era, that's no longer true. It's no longer the case that we can neatly distinguish those who commit crimes from those who commit acts of war, because the truth is terrorists do both. Any group that is capable of bringing down the World Trade Center has to be treated as a military threat. And yet many of the tools that we need to use against those who support or assist terrorism are law enforcement tools. And so one of the great challenges that we have is to develop a doctrine in the 21st century for how we deal with this kind of mixed threat that moves both from the military domain to the law enforcement domain. And I'm a firm believer in the all of the above approach, use every tool in the toolkit approach. And I believe that we need to use all of the elements of national power. Sometimes it means dropping ordnance someplace in Afghanistan or Pakistan. Sometimes it means arresting and trying someone on the streets of New York. We've done all of those things. We need to continue to do all of those things. And one of the challenges we have ahead of us is the cry that we hear from some people that we have to go back to the pre-9/11 way of thinking, which is it's all a criminal problem. It's all a matter of just subpoenaing people and indicting them, and we can't treat bin Laden and Hezbollah and these other terrorist groups as if they are a military threat. Now, I don't think President Reagan believed that, and I have a recollection of some military action in Libya that supports that belief. And I certainly don't think the American public after September 11th believes that we ought to tie a president's hands behind his or her back when it comes to dealing with what is a mortal threat to the people of this country. I also have to say that in many ways the strategic picture has darkened as it relates to terrorism over the last 25 years. We now have the phenomenon, which was not the case before, of ungoverned space, parts of the world where there is not a government that has control or is willing to exert control over terrorist activities taking place within its own borders. Of course, we saw that in Afghanistan prior to 9/11. And because the Taliban were unwilling to control bin Laden and al-Qaeda inside Afghanistan, they were able to recruit, train, plan, do scientific experiments, and ultimately order the execution of the greatest terrorist attack ever carried out, which was September 11th. Now, President Bush reacted vigorously and drove the Taliban out of Afghanistan, although this is still a fight that we are continuing to wage. But as the years pass, we've seen safe havens in parts of Pakistan, in the frontier areas, in Somalia, and in other parts of the world where government either lacks the willpower or lacks the capability to control what goes on in its own borders. So this creates a fertile breeding ground for the kind of non-state network I've talked about that we need to confront with this new doctrine, this doctrine of Homeland Security, which bridges and includes both military force and law enforcement activity. But even more than the physical space, the ungoverned space which creates a strategic threat, we have an ideological threat. And here again I want to go back to what President Reagan confronted with the Soviet Union. Because the issue with the Soviet Union was not just military force, it wasn't just territory, but it had to do with a particular ideology that the Soviets and their allies were trying to propagate around the world. There was an ideological contest that had to be won in order to end the Cold War. And that's really, to my mind, in the realm of foreign affairs, President Reagan's great work and his historic contribution. Here, too, we deal with an ideological struggle. There are violent extremists who try to hijack or pervert the teachings of Islam to construct an ideology of hatred against the West and against free people. And it is that ideology which fuels the network of terrorism that leads to bombs in Pakistan and India, attacks in Western Europe, and of course what we felt in our own country. And ultimately, to confront this challenge requires not only the doctrine of using military force and law enforcement capability, but confronting the ideology and pushing back on that ideology. And that means winning the hearts and minds of those who operate or who live in the recruiting grounds where the terrorists attempt to enlist those who would carry out their missions. And so I want to come back to my absolute most favorite thing I have relating to Ronald Reagan, which I kept in my office all during the 4 years of my tenure as Secretary of Homeland Security. It is a Xerox of 2 pieces of paper. One is a typewritten page from a draft of a speech that President Reagan eventually gave in June 1987 at the Berlin Wall. You all know that famous speech. It was the speech where he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." But if you look at the copy I have, which is a bootleg copy from the National Security Council files, you see that that line is crossed out. And there's some other scratches out in the language, and there's some additions made in someone's handwriting, not President Reagan's. And then the cover, the second page is the cover page, and it's a memorandum to a National Security Council official, who I will not name, from another official, saying, we're just about, I'm paraphrasing, we're just about to give up. We've tried everything to get this language taken out of the speech, and he just won't budge. This is our last effort to try to make this thing work, and if we can't get it done, I have no other suggestions. And of course, we know what the outcome was and what the speech finally was. What I love 2 things about this piece of paper. One is it reminded me of the importance of keeping in mind who is the principal and who is the staff. It is very easy in Washington for the staff to believe they run the principal, and the principal is merely a potted plant. And the great thing is to see how a masterful principal, Ronald Reagan, was able to deal with a pesky staff. But there's a larger message, which is really about keeping your eye on the big strategic picture, and that ties back to my point about the ideology of terrorism. And the larger picture is to recognize, as President Reagan did, that in the end, the Cold War would be resolved not by who had the most missiles and who had the most tanks, but by who prevailed in the contest of ideas. And by being willing to challenge the closed system of communism and do it directly and openly, and by not being apologetic for saying that there is good and evil in the world, President Reagan set in motion the forces that ultimately brought down the Berlin Wall. And that, I think, is a great lesson for leaders everywhere. It's very easy for the staff, which tends to get very focused on tactical issues, to think about dealing with global problems in terms of how do we get a tactical advantage, how do we make sure we don't offend somebody, how do we make sure we keep everything in a very polite and kind of conventional wisdom type of avenue. But it takes a leader of vision to understand sometimes you have to step out of the box in order to change the box entirely. And that's what separates a president from a staffer. And that's why I've always kept that piece of paper close at hand when I've been a principal. In fact, I think the great lesson of President Reagan for what we do in the ideological struggle that we face now is daring to challenge the ideological tenets of the enemy. Not feeling that, everybody's entitled to go their own way. The expression many years ago was different strokes for different folks. We have no right to tell other people how they ought to live their lives. Freedom is something only Americans should enjoy. Other people have no right to expect freedom. That kind of mentality is the mentality President Reagan rejected. And because he was willing to look beyond the conventional box, he changed the box entirely. Let me just, before I conclude, again tell a personal story about my experience with this. I, of course, am old enough to have lived through the period of time when President Reagan challenged the Soviet Union and ultimately the fall of the wall. But of course, it's faded in my memory, as it probably has for many Americans. In the last year, I had the privilege of going to Eastern Europe, to the Baltics, to Poland, to the Czech Republic, to Hungary, Slovakia. And I met with many of my counterparts as we worked to bring those countries into the visa waiver program, to give them the status that Western European visitors have had for many years. This was a deeply, deeply emotional moment for all of these countries. It was the final recognition of the end of the Cold War and the equality of status that these countries had with Western Europe. And I think I myself had underestimated the deep emotion with which my counterparts contemplated this great step forward. And in talking to them, I discovered many of the leaders of government today in Eastern Europe were students who were listening on the radio to Radio Free Europe or Voice of America, listening to President Reagan's speeches. And let me tell you, they don't forget what President Reagan did, and they don't forget the great accomplishment of tearing down the wall, and they don't forget what it was like to live under Soviet domination. And that's why Americans will find no better friends than the people of Eastern Europe, for whom the recollection of President Reagan's courage and the consequences of that courage is very vibrant and very much alive in their memory. And I wish I could take my kids, I will take my kids at some point there, because I would like our children to appreciate the tremendous accomplishment of liberating people from the yoke of tyranny. And I know that when people look at the Middle East now, there are some who criticize President Bush's vision, but I can tell you, I believe President Bush was inspired by the same vision of Ronald Reagan, that freedom is not to be hoarded, that there aren't second-class peoples out there who have no right to dream of democracy and rights, but that if we help others to liberate themselves, they will be eternally grateful, and they'll be eternally grateful friends of America. And I believe if you look at what's going on in Iraq now, it hasn't been easy, and it wasn't easy in the Cold War, and there were some missteps there too. But I can tell you in the end, I think we're seeing things in Iraq that could not have been dreamed of 10 years ago, and I think that's a great credit to the spirit of liberty and the spirit of leadership. So, what do I see as the challenges ahead? Well, one I think I've already alluded to, which is the growth of extremist ideology. Now, I think this is a very much, as they say in basketball, a jump ball. I think this could go two different ways. On the one hand, we do find that there are certainly those Al-Qaeda people or other similar groups that are out recruiting in madrasas or places all over South Asia, Africa, and Southeast Asia, building up a pool of potential terrorist recruits. But I can also tell you that there are Muslims who are increasingly and energetically speaking out against those people who try to convert Islam into an ideology of hatred. And by the way, for those who don't know, the ideology of Al-Qaeda is not really Islamic. It is actually a blend of old-style European fascism and Nazism, which got exported to the Middle East in the 30s, wrapped around in some language that seems to be religious, but really the roots of it are in European totalitarianism. So there are people speaking out against that. And I think if we engage with them and empower them, we can win this war of ideology or this contest of ideology, and we can see the extremists and the violent radicals pushed back where they came from in the caves and the side streets, instead of being able to carry out some of the attacks we've seen over the last few years. A second thing that faces us, I think, now, particularly in the last couple of years. After 9/11, we all talked about where the next attack would be. And I think one of the most difficult types of attack to deal with is the attack against a soft target, a commercial establishment, a hotel, a sporting event. Obviously, government buildings can be protected. Obviously, we protect the transportation infrastructure. We have protection for the airports, for the aircraft that we fly, for the rail stations. But what do you do about an attack launched against people congregating in the ordinary course of their life in a restaurant or in a store or at a sporting event? And as we've seen in the last 6 months in Mumbai and then a few days ago in Lahore, the terrorists are increasingly turning to soft targets as a venue for carrying out their attacks. That is going to create a major challenge for us in terms of our security, not just here in the U.S. but overseas, because the government is not going to be able to protect every restaurant and every store and every sporting event. We are going to have to increasingly partner with the private sector in enabling you to protect yourselves. And that means individual preparedness, it means business preparedness, it means school preparedness, and it means preparedness at the local and state level as well as the federal level. We do a fair amount of this. We have to do more. Now, there are always those who say, oh, you can't talk about that. That's fear-mongering. Fear-mongering because you're talking about a danger. And if we think about this, we may do things that distract us from what perhaps might be on somebody else's agenda. But I suggest to you, if you look at Mumbai and Lahore, and you look at the consequences of an attack and what it does to shake people's confidence, you realize that Charles de Gaulle was right when he said the very first responsibility of the state is to protect its people. That is the very first reason that the state exists. And so I think we're going to need to buckle up and get our resolve polished up and go out and make sure that what we see in Mumbai and Lahore doesn't happen in Los Angeles and Chicago and New York and smaller towns. And finally, let me say that we're going to have to deal aggressively with the issue of ungoverned space. It's not going to be enough to simply hope that the Pakistanis, and of course there really isn't a government in Somalia, but that somebody takes care of the problem in Somalia and Pakistan. We're going to have to insist on it. I believe that it's not enough to say that a country has a responsibility not to launch an attack on its neighbor. I believe a country has a responsibility not to permit its territory to be used as a platform to launch an attack against a neighbor. Indifference is not a defense and an excuse. And I think the international community is going to have to look at how we develop a plan and a program to deal with threats when a country is unwilling or unable to prevent the threat from emerging within its own borders. And finally, because I don't want to limit Homeland Security only to the issue of terrorism, I do have to take note of disturbing international trends in transnational crime. And nowhere is this more disturbing than to our south in Mexico. About a year ago, a little more than a year ago, as I noted increased violence, I asked the elements of my department, plus the Department of Defense, to put together a contingency plan in the event that violence crossed the border. And we have a plan in place, so I'm comfortable that we do have the ability to respond if violence spills over in any material way. We've also, I'm happy to tell you, built over 600 miles of that fence and completed about 95% to 98% of what needs to be done. And to me, that's really a force protection measure. That really protects our Border Patrol. But most important, we have to assure that Mexico wins its fight against its own organized crime gangs. The president of Mexico is a hero, President Calderon. He's like a President Reagan. He is taking them on, and they are fighting back with beheadings, with assassinations, with corruption, and with threats. If he can't get this job done, not only are Mexicans going to pay the price, we're going to pay the price. And that's why we were very strongly supportive, from the President Bush on down, of the Merida Initiative, which was getting Mexico the aid and assistance they need to do the job. That has got to continue, because if, God forbid, he loses in 2 or 3 years the kinds of things we see in Somalia and parts of Afghanistan, you're going to start to see in parts of northern Mexico. This is not a fight that can be lost. You've got a good president in Mexico. We've got to give him the support he needs. So we've got a lot of challenges, but I know the spirit in this room, the spirit embodied by President Reagan, leaves me no doubt that Americans can meet the challenges, and I look forward to working with whoever wants to join me in making sure that we do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. He has graciously accepted to take some questions from the audience. So we have some microphones, I hope. There we go. So if I pick on you, or if I select you, I should say, if you would wait till the microphone gets there. So who has the first question here? Oh, right there. Young lady in the blue and white.
Thank you. My concern is with illegal immigration. Being in the state of California and seeing how it may not be a bomb or something like that, but when our infrastructure, our schools, our hospitals is destroyed, I feel that my quality of life is greatly reduced. And I'm disappointed that the Bush administration didn't really do more as it relates to hearing average people raising children and what we're having to endure, because I see our country being taken over by this.
Well, I understand how you feel about it. I mean, this is a very big issue, and it's unfortunately an issue that has festered for decades. I mean, we didn't find ourselves in this situation over the last 4 or 6 years. I can give you some good news. I can tell you that during my tenure, not only did we dramatically increase the Border Patrol, we doubled it. Actually, if you go back to when the president took office, we built over 600 miles of fence. We dramatically increased our technology at the border, and we really, really increased the enforcement in the interior. And that's why you saw cases where literally, we had businesses which were literally 70 to 80% illegal workers that we shut down. We prosecuted the employers. We deported the people who were working illegally. We went from an old system of where they used to catch illegal migrants and release them on bail, and then they never came to court, to one where we detained everybody and we sent them back. But here's a great lesson on Chertoff and its cousin NIMBY, not in my backyard. You would not believe the dickens I got for enforcing the law over the last 2 years. I mean, the press was all over us for arresting people, sending people back where they came from, interfering with businessmen who wanted to have illegals do their business, creating environmental problems because we built a fence on the border, although I have to tell you that the environmental damage caused by people who cross illegally is far greater than caused by the fence. We got just an unbelievable barrage of criticism, but we kept at it, and I will tell you that in the fiscal year 2007, for the first time, the Pew Hispanic Center, so it's not a government statistic, not only said that there was a dramatic decrease in the flow of illegals across the border, but for the first time a dramatic net decrease in the number of illegals in this country. In other words, for the first time it went down from what had been the case in the prior decade. In every sector of the border, there was a dramatic decrease in the flow of illegal aliens. It went down anywhere from 15 to 30 or 40 or 50%. So we have made progress. And I will tell you that if the new administration continues on the enforcement side, we'll make more progress. But I also have to be honest and tell you, I think in the end, we will need, particularly when the economy improves, to find some way to deal with the need for temporary workers in places like the agricultural sector and some of the hospitality industries. And the key is to make that a legal process rather than an illegal process. So I believe if you keep faith with the American people and you show them, as we did, that we will enforce the law, and we did some pretty tough stuff, then I think it's fair also to say to the American people, we need to find a way to deal with labor needs when we have them in a way that's transparent, legal, regulated, and make sure that the people who come in the country are compatible with our own national security.
Let me follow up to that, because here recently I heard that the enforcement, as you say, of the laws, and because of the economic downturn and the budget crisis in our state, they're saying that if they find an illegal alien, arrest them, and they have a criminal record, instead of locking them up, they're not doing anything with them. How would you comment about that?
I understand everybody's got a budget problem. Would somebody say, we're not going to lock up burglars, we're not going to lock up, people who commit assault? The prisons here are overcrowded, and I understand that you need to deal with the issue of prison overcrowding. But I don't think taking categories of people and releasing them is the way to do it. I'm an old-time prosecutor. I mean, I was a prosecutor under President Reagan. And the truth is, when you lock up dangerous people and criminals, you actually reduce the crime rate. And that actually happened under President Reagan. And so we have empirical evidence. We don't have to philosophize about it. Obviously, the state needs budget help. I can't imagine an area where money would be better spent than making sure that people who are dangerous to the community are kept out of the community.
You might want to tell the administration that. We'll get you next. Right here.
You mentioned about how the internet is being used by terrorist groups and things like that. How might the internet be used to decrease that in social networking and things like that to positively impact?
You know, that's a great question, because I think you're right. Well, you know, almost any tool can be used for good as well as for bad. And using the internet to tell a positive story is a very, very important thing. Some of that is beginning to go on now. There was an interesting thing where Ayman Zawahiri, who's the #2 Al-Qaeda leader, actually did like an internet town hall. And people got on and started to criticize him because they had blown up a school bus of Algerian school children who were Muslims, and they were saying, how can you do this? You know, you're killing Muslims. What's the justification for this? And he got defensive about it. And it actually was a very, very significant moment, I think, in this ideological contest. I think you're exactly right. And I'm working with some people now on doing some social networking to see if we can begin to push back on this ideology by having people from the community itself. It can't be the government, it's got to be the community itself has got to say, wait a second, you're hijacking our religion and you're misusing it. And that's where the contest of ideas has to be fought.
So you're working with the community so in chat rooms like that, they're responding saying that this is wrong, why are you doing this?
We're bringing together people who are various kinds of foundations and groups that are working in this area to see how we can cross-fertilize and empower the groups and maybe help them raise some money so they can go out into the community, whether it's in the internet or sending people into communities to begin to push back against this ideology. Because if we're not on the playing field, we're going to lose. And it's made difficult in the United States because we're very sensitive to when the government gets involved in discussing religion, which is why, to me, this is something we have to do in the private sector. So you don't get into all this First Amendment concern about whether the government is somehow advancing a particular view on religion.
Right here, and then next. I know. Trust me on this one.
Good evening. Thank you for coming. Are there terrorist cells in the United States, and what is the department doing about them?
Well, we have had terrorist cells in the United States, and typically the way the government works is this. We will often surveil them in order to get intelligence. In other words, you want to know who they're meeting with, what they're doing, if you can discover a plan, what the network is. At some point you make a judgment, and it's a difficult judgment, that you've gotten about as much intelligence as you can, and then you want to close the cell down. And so that usually results in arrests. Occasionally, if you can't arrest someone, you can deport them, you deport them. Sometimes when those cases hit the newspapers, they don't seem very glamorous, because the general philosophy is we don't wait until the bomb is being, the fuse is lit for the bomb to swoop in, because then you're really taking an unnecessary risk. Much as I like 24, that's not a good model for actually real-life defense. You want to get them way before the 24-hour period. So if you read in the paper, there are cases you've seen around the country where we have put people in jail. There was a plot on JFK Airport. There were plots up in the Pacific Northwest. There have been plots there was a plot to blow up Fort Dix in New Jersey. Of course, there was the big plot to blow up the airliners from the United Kingdom to the United States, which the British took down and prosecuted. So yes, we do look at cells in the United States, but I'll tell you something else we do. We have a much better system now for keeping terrorists out of the country. The ability to sneak in through an airport is much less now than was the case 8 years ago. We have fingerprints, we collect information about people. You would be astonished and troubled at the number of times we turn somebody away because we learn that they have either some connection to a terrorist, or they're taking something into the country, like for example, the instructions for building an IED, an improvised explosive device, and you don't want that person in the United States. So maintaining vigilance at the borders is an important part of keeping us safe. Now, I'll proselytize for a minute. There are certain groups that don't like this. They don't like the fact that we take fingerprints. They don't want us to look at some of the very basic commercial travel information that we use to determine if someone is linked to a terrorist. They don't like it if we open up a laptop and we find an IED recipe or martyrdom videos or maybe just child pornography. And they want to make it hard to do that. But I can tell you that as you take these tools away, you start to increase the risk. So I'm not a believer in Fortress America. I think President Reagan was right. But I do believe you have to have locks on the door and locks on the window. And it's going to be very important over the next years to make sure that we don't lose the protections that we have built.
Right here.
Could you talk about your feelings about the new administration's plans to close down Guantanamo and the possibility of bringing the detainees into the American justice system?
Well, let me say first of all that Guantanamo has become a symbol that is departed from the actual reality of what's going on now. Guantanamo, as it is now, I haven't been there myself, but many, many people have reported, is probably a more comfortable prison facility than most of the state prisons here in California. Nevertheless, it remains that it has become, as a single word, branded in a negative way. The fundamental problem is, what do you do with the people there? And there are probably some that you can afford to release because either they're really not that dangerous or because they can be dealt with at home. There are some you probably can try, whether it's in a civil court or a military court. And then there are some that you probably can't do either to, but you don't have, you can't take the risk to release, and you've got to find some way to detain them. And it's got to be a legal process. You've got to give them an opportunity to, explain why it was just an accident that they happened to be at a training camp with Al-Qaeda. But you need to have the ability to hold them and not give them the same rights you give to, Americans in the purely criminal justice system. I think the good news is that the new administration has decided to go slowly, and that they've said they're going to take a year to do this, because I think that the encouraging thing is the recognition that once you own the responsibility, you have to take a second look at some of the things that have been said during campaigns. It's not that easy. It's easy to say, close it down. But when you start to ask for a show of hands about who wants someone moving next door, you don't get a lot of hands. So my hope is that the administration will take the year to really look at this question of how do we manage this population. If there are people that can be sent back, as the Bush administration did, that's great. That sends them back where they go to. If we can try some of these people, that's great. In the end, we're going to have to figure out a safe and secure place, though, to hold the people. And then we've got another problem coming down the line, because we also have prisoners of war in places like Afghanistan, people you capture on the battlefield. Now, right now, some of the people who brought cases against Guantanamo are bringing cases to release the people in Afghanistan. And here the administration so far, according to the newspapers, has resisted that. They've said that they don't believe that's appropriate. Again, that's good. I think I'm encouraged by that. But there's a larger issue we're going to have to face. How do you adapt the law to dealing with the fight that we now have, the global fight against terrorists? Because the old rules don't seem to work very well, and nobody has really sat down and put together a set of new rules. And until we do that, what we're going to wind up happening is having individual judges making decisions based on their own orientation, depending on whether they're lean this way or that way. And that's not a good way to run a railroad, and it doesn't give guidance to our service people or to our law enforcement people or to the country as a whole. So I think that, again, taking that year is a good idea. And now what needs to happen is we need to get a wide range of people who have expertise in this together to put together a plan that will keep Americans safe and eliminate some of the negative connotations that we've picked up over the last few years because of what has now come to be branded as Guantanamo.
So you're saying that the realities of Guantanamo are finally faced the new president,
Yeah.
and he's balking a little bit.
I know, what I'm saying is I think he's doing, you know, I mean, this may surprise people to have me praise the new administration, but I believe you ought to praise what should be praised, and when you disagree, you should disagree respectfully. In this case, I think he's done the right thing. He's taken his time. He's recognized that it's a hard problem, that the reason the place isn't empty is not because the Bush administration people weren't interested in dealing with it, but it was because it's difficult. And so I applaud the fact that he's now said, let's take a year, let's figure it out. We know we'd like to resolve this problem, but we're not going to rush into it. And I think that's an intelligent, sensible, and responsible way to deal with the problem.
In the very way back there.
You mentioned that we have parts of the world that are under government control, like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia, and Mexico, and that we have contingency plans in case things get worse in Mexico. What degree of commitment do you feel that our current administration and Nancy Pelosi and Reid have to make sure that we do gain control or have governmental control over these areas? And what can we do to raise their commitment to it and making it a higher priority?
Well, you know, of course, I can't speak for the new administration, and my answer to many of these questions is only time will tell, because at the outset, everybody talks in generalities. It's true of every administration, and what matters is the actual concrete decisions that are made when you're facing issues. I certainly think in terms of Pakistan and Somalia, I know that the Department of Defense has been working hard on that issue. Again, only from the newspapers, because I'm not on the inside anymore, but the newspapers report that the current administration is carrying out airstrikes in Pakistan. I think that's encouraging. Again, I want to applaud what I think is an important, responsible step to make sure that terrorists don't, you know, develop that safe haven that they have there. In Mexico, I think the test is going to be what do we do to help the Mexican government. When we passed the Merida initiative, there was a lot of resistance from some members of Congress, and they put some, you know, they tied the hands of the Mexican government to some extent. There were some apron strings attached. And while I think in general we gave a lot of good help, it was not quite as much and as flexible as it could have been. I think this is going to come up for funding in the next couple of years. And you've got to watch really carefully to make sure that we continue to get out there and support the Mexican government. We can't fight the fight in Mexico. They have to fight it. We're lucky because we have a president in Mexico who does have a lot of guts. But if he doesn't have the help, then he's not going to get the job done. And then I don't know what the next president will do. So it's important that we be there to support the Mexicans and what they're doing. But at the same time, you know, to use the old expression, trust but verify, I would say we have to trust but protect. I want to trust the Mexicans and the Mexican government in what they're doing, but I want to make sure that we continue to keep our contingency plan well exercised, well polished, and continue to build the capabilities that we would need if, God forbid, we started to see this violence cross the border.
All right, we're going to take one more question because we could spend here all night. Sheriff Brooks. Right here, Brianna. This is our local sheriff.
Thank you. A comment before the question. As a law enforcement professional and a graduate of the Naval Postgraduate School, which you supported, thank you very much. It was a wonderful program. I watched with a great deal of interest, as did my peers, the process of protecting America by pulling together a couple of dozen entrenched, powerful, historically uncooperative federal agencies under one umbrella. Very few people thought that could work. Very few people thought that it could work quickly. And now, given a number of years, not only has that happened to a degree I don't think many people believed was possible, but also cooperating with 50 states, 3,000 counties, innumerable other agencies that are involved. You made it work, and I tip my hat to you and give you a tremendous amount of credit.
Thank you very much.
And another thing that most people didn't believe is that we could go this many years without another major attack, and I think you share a great deal of the credit for that. And for all the law enforcement officers that work on the ground, America's safer, Ventura County is safer because of your efforts. We see it every day. We see it in the relationship with our federal partners, and we're very grateful for that. My question that follows that is, Americans tend to react to the latest disaster. After 9/11, the focus was Homeland Security. After Hurricane Katrina, it was off of terrorism and onto natural disasters. Great strides have been made in that regard as well. Now with the economy and time passing without a major attack, do you believe the American public can sustain the proper level of interest to support an effective Homeland Security machinery?
You know, that's a great question to end on. First, let me thank you, Sheriff, because I think the key to keeping America safe starts with local law enforcement and county law enforcement. And coming from a professional, your words mean an awful lot to me, so I appreciate that. Here's what I think. I think the American public is capable of sustaining the resolve to continue to do what we need to do to stay ahead of the enemy. Because I think, you know, this is a dynamic process. We're doing well now, but we could fall behind if we don't keep it up. And the reason I have faith in the American public is because when I travel around from time to time, more often than you might think, people come up to me and tell me some of their stories about dealing with this. You know, yesterday I was on a train coming back from New York, and someone got up to get off at an intermediate stop, and they handed me a note, and they said, "My brother died in the World Trade Center on September 11th. Thank you for doing a very, very important job for America." Getting on the plane today, one of the ground agents for the airline came up to me as I was walking up the jetway, and he said, "I want to tell you that I was in Miami on August 28th, and I actually met and sold a ticket to one of the hijackers. And later I was interviewed by the FBI, and he said, I know what that meant, and thank you for the job you're doing." So I am totally confident in the American people, but I'm not always confident in politicians. And that brings us back to the very point that Duke made at the beginning of this presentation about not in my backyard, not in my term of office. I have met some terrific political leaders in Washington. Frankly, I've met both Republicans and Democrats. This is not a partisan issue. And some of them do absolutely understand and commit to doing the right thing, and they don't care whether it happens in their term of office or not. But too many don't. And that's where we need the spirit of Ronald Reagan. I also have to say, because the president I served for the longest was President Bush, he had that spirit. He did not think about what's the poll number going to be. He thought about what's good for the country. And there are others on both sides of the aisle. But too many don't have that spirit. And the media often doesn't have that spirit. Many in the media focus on, what's the last 24-hour news cycle. So it's up to the public to insist that the politicians do the job that they're supposed to do. And whether it is terrorism, natural disasters, or financial disasters, again and again we learn a very sad lesson. If we don't make the investment up front, we pay a much higher price on the back end. So finally, we ought to do what we have to do. And I think this, to me, and this is the most important mission I have carried out of my tenure, is to make the case for the kind of responsible leadership that makes the investments that we need long term, and not the earmarks or the pork that gets us elected in the next 2 years. And that's something all of you can be involved in and do.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. It's great to hear your words of wisdoms, and hopefully we can all take that back in our everyday lives, that it's important for us to keep our eyes and ears open. For those of you who have not seen our wonderful exhibit on the Magna Carta, I welcome you back, or I think it might still be open for a little bit longer. And other than that, please enjoy the dinner. Thank you very much.